I'm Daisy.
And I'm Terry.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 148.
And this week, it's Daisy's turn to share something with us. Daisy, what do you have?
Well, Terry, I have a bit of a tease. Gretchen Rubin has a new book coming out about the 5 senses. The book is called Life in 5 Senses. It's available to pre-order. I think it's coming out about the middle of April. Not very long now, but I will put a link for where you can pre-order in all the normal places, but if you go to the link that I'll put in the description, there's some bonus content on offer if you pre-order via there. I seem to remember I did it before, either with her or somebody else. You go back with proof of purchase and you get access to, in this case, a 5-video series of experiments to explore your own senses. Now, as you know, I'm a fan of Gretchen Rubin's work, and so I was quite excited to hear about this new book that's coming up. And I can't remember why I decided to look, probably because I'd heard this new book coming up, but I went to have a look at her podcast, Happier with Gretchen Rubin, because I thought, she's bound to be talking about it a bit, and I'll find some episodes there to share with you. And so that's what I've got. Couple of episodes, number 420, a bonanza, no less, of hacks for using our 5 senses for happier lives. As you know, and as we've discussed before, that's what Gretchen Rubin's all about, isn't she? She's about various hacks of different things, whether it's the 4 tendencies or figuring out whether you're an abstainer or a moderator. It's all about trying to make your life a bit happier. The more we understand about ourselves, the more we can hack some of these habits and tendencies and all the rest of it. Ideally, the happier we can be. And the other one was one of her little shorts. They're called Little Happier episodes. One thing that surprised me in my study of the 5 senses. So I thought both of these sounded quite interesting. But a little bit about the book. This is the blurb on Amazon or wherever else you buy books. In this journey of self-experimentation, Gretchen Rubin explores the mysteries and joys of the 5 senses as a path to a happier, more mindful life. Drawing on cutting-edge science, philosophy, literature, and her own efforts to practice what she learns, she investigates the power of tuning in to the physical world. That's sort of about all I could glean, really, about the book. There's also a quiz. You know how she's good about having a quiz. And although I tried to do the quiz, I think everybody else was trying to do the quiz because I did it on the back of a newsletter. That's what kicked it off. Comes to me in the end. She sent out a newsletter talking about her new book. And I think maybe talking about this quiz. And it's about identifying which are the more underused senses. So I get the impression that this book will not only be talking around the different senses, but helping you identify the ones that are underused in your own life and how to use them a bit more to enrich and make your life a bit happier. That's the impression I get. And the quiz is along those lines. And I went to try and do it, but like I said, I think everyone else was trying to do it and it just kept crashing and I got cross and didn't do it, and I've forgotten to go back and do it. So I don't know what my underused senses are, but I can make a pretty good guess. I'm sure I will be back in an episode at some future date to talk about the book itself because I am going to pre-order it. But there were some fun things that came up in this hacks episode. It was, I think most of the episodes, I don't listen to it on a regular basis, but it's usually her and her sister chatting about things. And so they shared some of the hacks that they have around the 5 senses, but they also were sharing those that had been sent in by listeners. And so I decided what I would do is just pick out my favorites for each of the 5 senses to share with you. So the first one is sight. And they were talking about, this is one of the ones that was sent in, and they were talking about using online maps, something like Google Maps or whatever, using the GPS to find your way around a new city or whatever it is. And apparently there's a little green cone that comes out from the little person who's looking at which direction they're going, and it's pointing in the range you're going, so it's directional. But it also apparently tells you how specific it is by how wide the cone is. Apparently the wider it is, the less sort of accurate it is. And if it's not too accurate, apparently you can hold your phone up and do a big figure of 8 in the air, and it kind of resets and improves it. And this made me laugh, this hack, because they were talking about how useful this was, and it was tapping into the sense of sight and all the rest of it. But it made me laugh because I have a bit of a hatred of using GPS and using sat navs. I prefer the more old-fashioned using maps and using landmarks and things like that. And it reminded me of when Louise and I nearly came to blows. We were finding our way. I think it was when we were at the PHC conference, I think, in London, and we had to get from the place we were staying to where the conference was, and she was using the GPS on her phone. And although I'd paid reasonable attention when we were walking back the evening before, and so I had a sort of vague sense I hadn't been paying enough attention as I would have done if I knew I had to find my way back, but I sort of had a vague sense. And so we were walking along, and I said, are you sure we're going the right way? Because I could have sworn we went the other way at that particular shop or whatever it was. Oh, no, it says, this way. So we followed it along, and we're walking, bearing in mind, I think the walk home had taken half an hour or something. We'd been walking for 20 minutes or so, and nothing was looking familiar. In fact, it was looking the opposite of familiar. I think, you sure we're going the right way? And then before long, we got to a tube station that was very much nowhere near where we were supposed to be going. And anyway, to cut what could end up being an even more rambly story than it's already turning into, we were going in pretty well the opposite direction of where we should be going. And so we had to sort of reset, and we did end up getting there just in time. But it took us twice as long as it should have done. So when we went to stay in Paris together, I put an absolute ban on using GPS, and I got an old-fashioned tourist map and insisted on being the navigator for the time we were there, and use those old-fashioned things like your eyes and picking out landmarks and things like that. So I'm very old school when it comes to finding my way, and I do this with car journeys as well. I don't like relying on the sat nav because it tends to not necessarily send me the wrong way, but it's sort of saying take this exit off the roundabout, and it's not very clear, and I end up taking the wrong exit, and I end up getting super, super cross. So when I've got to go somewhere new, I look it up on Google Maps, I map out where I'm going, I draw myself a little map with, looking out for landmarks, and I look, I'm looking for these things that I've written down, look out for the big Tesco's, you're turning left after that. I'm looking for things like that. So I thought it was funny that they were using this as a hack for sight, and for me, it was almost the antithesis of tapping into that sense. So that was sight. For sound, they talked about using headphones with an app or something with white noise playing. If you were somewhere, I think they were talking about a very noisy stadium. And if you just needed to tune out for a bit, if you were somewhere very loud or somewhere that had annoying sounds. And it reminded me of my favourite podcaster, Adam Buxton. He talked about getting very irritated quite often on train journeys with all sorts of noise going on, especially when he was supposed to be in the quiet carriage. He got, really, really cross about it. So he got himself one of these white noise apps, and he said it was brilliant in just zoning it all out. So that's a way to tap into sound, to your sense of hearing. For taste, I particularly like this idea. They were suggesting doing a cheese tasting. And the person who'd written in was saying that they'd had a bit of a party, a get together, and they were trying 10 different cheeses. But they were saying, it was a really good all round fun experience. And Gretchen and her sister were talking about how much they love this idea because it's something that everyone can do. Yeah, unless you don't like cheese, but obviously doesn't have to be cheese, it can be whatever you like, but it's something everyone can do. It's sociable, coming back to this social connection and being with other people. It's a good talking point and it's memorable. They talked about touch and how it can be really useful for stress relief and also for focus. And the example that was sent in was somebody who used it. She's got a piece of Velcro that is stuck to the underside of her table that she touches it while she's in online meetings, just to kind of bring that focus back to what she's supposed to be doing. And they also talked about having soothing things like, a really lovely smooth stone or something like that. And I think we've discussed this in an episode. I can't for the life of me remember which one it is, but there was something about using touch to bring that focus back into what you were doing.
Yeah, it's a nice grounding technique.
Yeah.
I used to use it a lot as a therapist when clients who were kind of starting to dissociate from maybe some traumatic things being triggered, that I had a really soft couch and I would just encourage them to put their hands on the couch and to kind of feel that texture of the couch, or some way getting yourself connected in that moment. It's a nice way to ground yourself.
Right. So that makes sense. And then last but not least, smell. And it made me laugh. And it was the first sense that I thought of that I thought would probably come up in this quiz for me, because it's something that I have issues with. I'm a bit sensitive actually to smells. But smell is so evocative, and in some ways, maybe one of the most subjective, and context is really important. This was something that comes up in the Little Happier episode. The one thing that surprised me in my study of the five senses was the title of that episode. This was it. She said it's something that she knew, that she was aware of, that our five senses, our own five senses, they are very subjective. It's our sensual world. But she was just really reminded of that, how very subjective it is. And she used the example for her of how she loves the scent of narcissus. They really remind her of the holidays. She called herself an underbuyer, I think was the term she used, that she really liked the scent of narcissus, and it was really evocative of the holidays, and she would love to have them around, but she was an underbuyer, so she rarely actually ended up buying them and enjoying them. But because she was writing this book, she thought, yes, I really should buy some of those. So she bought herself some narcissus, and she loved them. She loved having them there for the holidays, and every time she walked into the room was filled with the scent, and she just found it absolutely wonderful. And she was talking to her daughter, and this is where the whole subjective element comes in. She was talking to her daughter and talking about how much she loved the scent of these narcissus, and her daughter was like, "Oh my God, is that what it is? Is that what that terrible smell is?" She said, "I thought a mouse had died somewhere or something. It's awful. Every time I come in, the smell is disgusting." And I mean, that would be me. When I mentioned that I'm sensitive to smell, things, that kind of scent would drive me crazy. But then she said what was quite interesting, and this was the other thing that she talked about in this short episode, was that context is really important. So actually, once her daughter had a slightly different context, a few days later she said, "Oh, actually, I'm learning to like the smell of these a bit. once she knew it wasn't a dead mouse and she didn't have that context in her mind that she knew it was these pretty flowers, and she put the smell with the context, she started to like it a little more. And it made me think of, the smell of food cooking. You think how subjective that is, in that whether you like the smell of the food that's cooking, but how important the context is. If you're feeling really hungry and you walk past the waft of something cooking, can really, get your juices flowing, the saliva fairly running out of your mouth because you're drooling, you're really hungry. But if you've just eaten and you're really stuffed and you walk down, like I've got an issue down in the hallway downstairs where I've exposed the brickwork, and I need to go round and fill all the holes in because all the cooking smells come through from the neighbours, and they like using a lot of spices and things. And sometimes, I think that smells quite nice, but most times it's like, no, that the smell is just awful. So very subjective, and context matters. And I think it's quite easy to think of a sort of over sensory load. They talked a bit about, there was an example from somebody who had a child who was autistic, and she was talking about this sort of pack that she carries around all the time. Apparently it has some really strong mints in it for grounding, a Where's Wally book, some noise cancelling headphones, soft blanket, things like that. So I imagine if you're autistic yourself, or somebody, or you work with someone, you're very aware of these senses and how easy it is to for people like that maybe to be overwhelmed. But how much do we all tap into this? How much are we aware of our senses all the time? And for me, like I just mentioned about smell, and I will go at great lengths sometimes to avoid the smells that pop up. I think I've complained to you about the smells from the downpipes outside of the upstairs neighbour using very overly scented, in my opinion, washing powder, and the smell of that would just waft through my flat, and it's unbearable. So I sorted that out by changing the way the pipes work. But for somebody else, they might really like that smell. So there's sort of that negative aspect where maybe you're trying to avoid some of your senses being overloaded in ways you don't like. But I really liked some of these more positive hacks where you can come up with some ideas to use the senses. And I think this is probably much more where the book is focused on. And there were a couple of nice examples, particularly for making memories of holiday. If you think about holidays you've had, and I think this is where something like sense of smell is so evocative. I can always remember the first time when I went to Bangkok, things like the smell of the markets and some of the different foods, and were you to smell that later on, it brings it back straight away. But they were talking about how you can hack this, how you can sort of forward hack it to make memories. So make a holiday more memorable by their suggestions were, for example, having a special taste for the holiday. So maybe a drink that you choose, something that you haven't tried before. I can't remember what they said, something, it was some kind of like a daiquiri or something. I can't remember, but some fancy cocktail or whatever it is. But choosing a drink for the holiday that you enjoy while you're on that holiday, that is something, not something that you usually drink. And then months later, when you have that drink, it's going to send you right back to the wonderful time you had when you were on holiday. Or maybe choose a holiday scent, they suggested. So, you could, if you're into perfume, and my idea of a nightmare, if you're ever going on holiday with me, don't use this hack because I won't like it. But, pick out a lovely perfume as you're going through the duty free, and that's your holiday scent. And forevermore, that scent is going to remind you of that special holiday and the people you were with. And I thought that was rather nice, sort of getting in there and sort of planning how you can use the senses to help you remember something enjoyable.
That one always fascinates me, Daisy, is that and I'm not remembering all of the brain science about it, but the fact that our sense of smell, our olfactory system, is very connected to memories. And I believe it's because there's kind of a direct route from our olfactory nerve to the amygdala, which is our emotion processing part of the brain.
That makes sense, yeah.
And to the hippocampus, which is the part of our brain that's involved in memory. And so I may have said this before on this podcast, but I have a very vivid memory of when I smell, and I don't buy this anymore, but I don't even know if they still make it, but there was a type of deodorant called Dry Idea. And I wore that in 7th grade. And years later, when I would smell that deodorant, it would take me back to walking into my 7th grade science class. Now, I don't remember exactly why I was smelling Dry Idea so much. Maybe I had just put some on after gym class or something, but that is the scent. And when I smell that, I'm instantly taken back to Mrs. McHugh's 7th grade science class. So it ties to memory, ties to emotion, and obviously then ties to emotional memories. So also on the flip side of that, for people who have experienced a trauma, certain scents may trigger those responses. So let's say, for example, going back to a holiday, and I'm talking not vacation, but actual like celebration holiday. What if something negative had happened to me with the scent of cinnamon? And then every year at Christmas time, everyone's bringing out the pine cones scented in cinnamon. And I don't want to walk into the stores because it brings back this traumatic stuff.
Yeah.
So I might want to use...
Cuts both ways.
Yeah, I might want to use, though, this strategy of creating some new scents or creating some new memories with that scent so that it's not only triggering the negative ones. I'd have to do a little more research into that, but that's an interesting concept.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you could tap into what we've talked about neuroplasticity, about remaking those pathways. So that cinnamon track can just try and set up a new one or overlay it with something that's a more positive memory.
Yeah.
There was just one last thing that was another one that was sent in was a stress relief exercise with something that she called ocean breathing. I hadn't heard about it, but apparently it's just a way of you breathe in and out through your nose, but trying to sort of make a sound like the ocean, the waves. So, you're breathing in and out. And then she was talking about how she tapped in some of the other senses. So she would visualize the waves rolling in and going out as she was doing this breathing. So you've got the sound there, you've got the sight there. And she was saying maybe she would light some ocean scented candles, so to have the scent there as well. And I was thinking you could almost take it to another level and put a little salt crystal on your tongue. And we've talked about this before, about layering up as many of the senses as possible if you're trying to, I think maybe it was when we were talking about, when you're trying to remember something, the more layers you can add, the more sensory layers you can add, the more likely to remember it.
It is fascinating what our senses, I think of them just on a kind of cursory surface level. Oh yeah, they do these things for us, but how embedded they are into how we make sense of things, how we experience things, our emotional state. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and how much we just take them for granted. I think that's what's going to be interesting about this book, because on one level it sounds like, I think that's what she taps into really quite well. That all sounds so obvious. Kind of, yes, it does, but she manages to pull it apart and make you think about it in different ways. And like I said at the beginning, it sounds like she's going to get you to investigate, both become much more aware of your sensory environment and how you use the different senses, but to investigate a lot more the ones that are underused and how to utilize them a bit more. There's a short article on the book pre-order page just asking about foreground versus background senses. So the foreground ones are senses that you notice the most and give you the most pleasure, and background is the opposite, senses that don't grab your attention and are not major sources of pleasure. And she says that the aim of her project is to pull all of these 5 senses into the foreground. So I'm quite excited to find out what she has to say about it. So I shall report back at a later date.
I was going to say, this is one of those times where I feel lucky because I will be able to skip reading this because I'm going to get the explanation from you to really decide if I want to. But I have benefited a lot from many of your discussions about her work. So I look forward to hearing afterward what you found.
So to be continued. Until that time, well, until next week, have a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everybody.